This is Miss Humbert here. Today we're going to be doing Unit 4 Notes 5. So we're going to be talking about the zero product property and its applications. So today we're going to learn about why factoring is so important and what factoring can do for us. So first of all, let's figure out what the zero product property is. So the zero product property says that if A times B is equal to 0, then either my A is going to be equal to 0 or my B is going to be equal to 0. So that kind of makes sense, right? In order to multiply to 0, something has to be multiplied by 0. So how are we going to use this? So currently, number one, as it looks as if someone had gone through and factored it. So what we can do with this now is we can actually take each of those factors and set them equal to 0. So x plus 6 is equal to 0. X minus 4 is equal to 0. So for this first one, you can subtract 6 from both sides, and you get that x is equal to a negative 6. Here you can add 4 to both sides, and you get that x is equal to a positive 4. So then my solution for number 1 is x is equal to negative 6 and x is equal to positive 4 because we solved those equations for x. Number 2 is going to be the same thing. We're going to take 2x plus 8 and set it equal to 0, and 3x plus 2 and set that equal to 0. And then we're going to solve each of these equations for x. So then I get 2x is equal to a negative 8, divide both sides by 2, and I get that x is equal to a negative 4. So that's one of my solutions. The other one comes from the other parentheses. So I'm going to start by subtracting 2 from both sides. I get 3x is equal to negative 2. Divide both sides by 3, and I get that x is equal to a negative 2/3. So that's your final answer for number 2. Let's take a look at 3 and 4. Again, same idea. We're just taking each of those factors and setting them equal to 0. So I'm going to erase that there, and 2x minus 6 is equal to 0. X plus 4 is equal to 0. So then again, we're just going through and solving each of these equations. Okay, so then we end up getting that 2x is equal to 6. So then we're going to divide both sides by 2. And here I get that x is equal to 3. On this one, subtract 4 from both sides, and I get that x is equal to negative 4. So each of these has two solutions. For this one, it's x is equal to 3 and x is equal to negative 4. I'm going to go ahead and have you guys try number 4 on your own. Let's take a look at number 5. So for number 5, we've never seen anything like this before. We can't solve this by normal solving equations methods because of that squared there. Okay, so we can't just solve it. What we did learn is how to factor. So what we need to do is we need to factor this quadratic, set each of our factors equal to 0, and then solve. So we will end up getting an answer, and we can set, but we're going to have two answers. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take 1 times negative 20, and that's a negative 20. So we're multiplying to negative 20 and adding to 1. So that's going to be 5 and negative 4. So I'm going to use that to split up my y. So I have y squared plus 5y minus 4y minus 20 is equal to 0. Well, now that I have 4 terms, I can go ahead and factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my two groups. Out of the first group, I can take out a y, and then I'm left with y plus 5. Out of the second group, I need to take out a negative. Between negative 4 and negative 20, I'm going to take out a negative 4, and then I'm left with y plus 5. And that's equal to 0. I'm not worried about the equals to 0 part until I've completely solved. So then, I'm going to get y plus 5 in one parenthesis, and then y minus 4 in the other parenthesis. So now I'm going to take my y plus 5 and set that equal to 0, and my y minus 4 and set that equal to 0. So here I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and I end up getting that y is equal to a negative 5. Here I'm going to add 4 to both sides, and I end up getting that y is equal to 4. So my solutions to that quadratic are y is equal to negative 5 and y is equal to 4. Let's take a look at number 6. So for number 6, you need to set up your x. So you're going to have to multiply 6 times a negative 6. And that's going to give you a negative 36. So you're multiplying to a negative 36 and adding to 5. Well, we need to have a positive and a negative factor to multiply to negative 36. So that's a positive 9 and a negative 5. So now or negative 4, I'm sorry. Negative 4. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to keep my first term the same, then I'm going to split up 5, that's P, not R. 5P is 9P minus 4P minus 6 is equal to 0. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to go ahead and make my two groups. Between 6 and 9, I can take out a 3 and a P. So I'm dividing each of these by 3P. So then I get 2P plus 3 in my first group. Out of my second group, I could take out a negative and a 2. So when I divide each of these terms by negative 2, I said 2P plus 3. So I don't have room for my equals 0 now, but it's still equal to 0. So then my leftovers are matching, so I'm going to factor those out. And then I'm going to write what's left over in the second parenthesis. Now remember that all of that is equal to 0. So we need to take and we need to set each of these factors equal to 0. So then I'm going to go and I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I get 2P is equal to negative 3. Divide both sides by 2. And I get that P is equal to a negative 3 halves. Here I can add 2 to both sides. And then I get 3P is equal to 2. Divide both sides by 3. And then I get that P is equal to 2/3. So my answers are P is equal to negative 3 halves and P is equal to 2/3. Let's take a look at number 7. So for number 7, we're going to be multiplying out for our x. So we're multiplying to a negative 35 and adding to a negative 2. So because we have a negative sum, we need a positive and a negative factor. So what multiplies to 35 and adds to negative 2? Positive 5 and negative 7. Remember, the order of that x can be flipped around. So I'm going to use that to split up my 2p. So I have p squared plus 5p minus 7p minus 35 is equal to 0. And now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So between p squared and 5p, I can divide out a p. So I'm dividing each of these terms by p, and I'm left with p plus 5. Then out of my second group, I need to take out a negative GCF. Between negative 7 and negative 35, I can take out a negative 7. And then I'm left with p plus 5. So here, my leftovers are matching, so I can factor those out. And then I'm going to write what's left over after that. So then I'm going to go ahead and set each factor equal to 0. So p plus 5 is equal to 0, and p minus 7 is equal to 0. So for the plus 5, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and then I get that p is equal to a negative 5. For the minus 7, I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and then I get that p is equal to 7. So I get that p is equal to negative 5 and positive 7. Next, let's take a look at number 8. Now, number 8 is a little bit of a different case because for number 8, I can take out a greatest common factor first. So between 6, 14, and 12, I can divide out a 2. 3r squared minus 7r minus 6 is equal to 0. So that'll make my factoring easier in the long run. Now here's the deal. Do you remember when we were factoring initially with the greatest common factor, and I always said you need to make sure you have your little sister at the end? Well, now that it's set equal to 0, you don't. You can actually completely annihilate your little sister. You can divide both sides by 2 and get rid of that greatest common factor altogether. So I don't even have to worry about that 2 because 0 divided by 2 is just 0. So that 2 has now been taken care of and it's not something I have to worry about anymore. So now I'm ready to set up my x. So I'm taking 3 times a negative 6, which is a negative 18, adding to a negative 7. So that's going to be a negative 9 and a positive 2. So now I'm going to use that to split up my negative 7. So I have 3r squared minus 9r plus 2r minus 6 is equal to 0. Remember, the only thing that changes is that middle term. The first and the last term stay the same. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. Between 3r squared and 9, I can divide out 3r. And then I'm left with r minus 3. Between 2 and 6, I can take out a 2, and then I'm left with r minus 3, and that's equal to 0. So now I can go ahead and I can make my groups. So I can go ahead and I can take r minus 3 out, and 3r plus 2, and set it equal to 0. So what if you forgot to take out the greatest common factor? It still will solve to be the same. You're just going to have larger numbers that you have to deal with. So I like to take the greatest common factor out if I can to make it easier. So I'm going to say that r minus 3 is equal to 0 and 3r plus 2 is equal to 0. So then here I'm going to add 3 to both sides. And I get that r is equal to 3. Here I first need to subtract 2 from both sides. I get that 3r is equal to negative 2. Divide both sides by 3. And then I get that r is equal to a negative 2/3. So r is equal to a negative 2/3, and r is equal to 3. So that's all you have to do for your note video today. Please remember to take your Schoology quiz. You'll be doing the back side of the notes in class tomorrow, so please make sure you bring headphones. Thanks for listening.